I used to believe that love meant sacrifice, that caring for someone meant putting their needs before your own, no matter the cost. For 15 years of marriage, I lived by this creed, pouring myself into a relationship that slowly drained me of everything I once was. My name is Sarah, and this is the story of how I finally learned to choose myself. When I first met David at a college party in 1995, he was everything I thought I wanted. Confident, charming, with an easy smile that made everyone in the room gravitate toward him. I was 21, studying literature, dreaming of becoming a writer. He was business major with grand plans to start his own company. We dated through our senior year, and when he proposed right after graduation, I said yes without hesitation. I thought I was stepping into a fairy tale. The early years of our marriage seemed perfect from the outside. David started his consulting firm while I took a job at a local newspaper to support us. I told myself it was temporary, that once his business took off, I could focus on my writing. The small apartment we rented was filled with dreams and possibilities. I cooked elaborate dinners after my long days at work, cleaned house on weekends, and typed up David's business proposals late into the night. He always said I was his secret weapon, his partner in everything. But somewhere along the way, temporary became permanent. David's business did take off, but my dreams seemed to shrink with each passing year. When I brought up the idea of freelance writing or taking a creative writing course, David would smile and say, "Honey, we need stability right now. Your job provides the steady income we need." When I suggested we could afford for me to work part-time since his business was thriving, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "But you're so good at what you do. Why change a good thing?" The newspaper job itself became a source of deep frustration. What had started as an entry-level position with promises of advancement had stagnated into a dead-end administrative role. My supervisor, Margaret Shun, was a brilliant journalist who had mentored me during my first year. She often pulled me aside to suggest story ideas or encourage me to pitch feature articles. "You have a natural instinct for narrative," she would say. "Don't let it go to waste sitting behind that desk all day." But every time I considered pursuing Margaret's suggestions, David would remind me of our responsibilities. The mortgage on our small starter home, the car payments, the growing expenses of his business. "Once we're more established," he would promise, "then you can explore more creative opportunities." Years passed, and more established remained perpetually just out of reach. Meanwhile, David's consulting firm grew steadily. He specialized in helping mid-sized companies streamline their operations, and his natural charisma made him excellent at client relations. I watched him transform from the uncertain graduate student I had married into a polished businessman who commanded respect in boardrooms across the city. The change was gradual but profound, and somewhere along the way, I began to feel like I was falling behind. Our social circle evolved to match David's rising status. The otherwise were mostly successful professionals in their own right, doctors and lawyers and business executives who juggled demanding careers with family obligations. At dinner parties, conversations revolved around stock options and vacation homes and private school applications. I found myself growing quieter at these gatherings, having little to contribute when everyone shared their latest achievements. By our 5th anniversary, the pattern was firmly established. I worked 40 hours a week at the newspaper, handling the administrative side rather than writing. I came home to cook, clean, and listen to David's stories about his successful deals and growing client base. My own day, my own struggles, my own small victories never seemed worth mentioning in comparison to his achievements. When friends asked about my writing, I started making excuses. "I'm too busy right now. Maybe next year. David needs me to focus on our life together." The lies became so automatic that I almost believed them myself. I convinced myself that supporting David's dreams was the same as pursuing my own, that his success would somehow fulfill us both. But late at night, when he was asleep and the house was quiet, I would sometimes take out the notebook where I used to write poetry and stare at the blank pages. The words wouldn't come anymore. It was as if that part of me had simply dried up from neglect. When David's business partner, Michael Torres, suggested they expand into government contracting, everything accelerated. The potential contracts were enormous, but they required significant upfront investment and countless hours of proposal writing. David threw himself into this new opportunity with single-minded determination, working 18-hour days and traveling constantly to meet with potential clients. During this period, I barely saw my husband except in passing. He would leave before I woke up and return after I had gone to bed. Our conversations became logistical exchanges about schedules and bills and household maintenance. I felt like a housekeeper in my own marriage, maintaining the infrastructure of our life while David pursued his ambitions. The loneliness was crushing, but I told myself it was temporary. David promised that once they secured these government contracts, he would have more flexibility and we could focus on building our family. The idea of children had always been part of our plan, but the timing never seemed right. First, David needed to establish his business. Then he needed to expand it. Then he needed to secure these crucial contracts. I started spending more time with my sister Lisa, who lived across town with her 3 young children. Lisa had married her college boyfriend straight after graduation and dedicated herself entirely to motherhood. Her house was chaotic and loud and filled with the kind of life I had begun to wonder if I would ever experience. "You and David should start trying soon," Lisa would say, watching me play with her youngest daughter. "You're not getting any younger, and David's business is doing well now. What are you waiting for?" I couldn't explain that I was waiting for my husband to come home, to be present in our marriage long enough to discuss something as significant as bringing children into our lives. When I tried to bring up the subject with David, he would nod absently and promise we would talk about it soon. But soon kept getting pushed further into the future as his business demands intensified. The children came next. First Emma, then 2 years later, Jake. I loved them fiercely, completely, but their arrival marked the final burial of my writing dreams. David's business required more travel, longer hours, important client dinners. He provided financially, but the daily reality of raising 2 small children while working full-time fell entirely on my shoulders. When I mentioned feeling overwhelmed, David would remind me how lucky we were that his success allowed us to have such a comfortable life. "Other families struggle to make ends meet," he'd say. "We have everything we need." Emma was born during one of the most stressful periods of David's career. The government contracts had materialized, but they came with brutal deadlines and exacting requirements. David was traveling 3 weeks out of every month, leaving me to handle the newborn largely alone. I had taken only 6 weeks of maternity leave, returning to work exhausted and emotionally depleted. Margaret had been promoted to managing editor by then, and she fought hard to get me a reduced schedule during Emma's first year. 30 hours a week, same benefits, she offered. You can work from home 2 days a week and focus on some feature writing. It's not much, but it's something. When I presented this opportunity to David, his reaction was swift and decisive. "Absolutely not," he said. "We can't afford any reduction in your income right now. The business has significant overhead, and we need every dollar of your salary to maintain our standard of living." I tried to argue that the slight pay reduction would be offset by savings on childcare and that the opportunity to do actual writing might lead to better positions later. But David was immovable. He pulled out spreadsheets showing our monthly expenses, projected costs for Emma's future education, and the importance of maintaining our financial trajectory. "This is about more than money," he explained with the patience he might use with a child. "It's about stability and security for our family. Your job provides guaranteed income and excellent benefits. Writing is unpredictable and competitive. We can't build a family's future on something so uncertain." So I returned to my administrative position full-time, pumping breast milk in a supply closet during breaks and rushing home during lunch to feed Emma. David hired a full-time nanny, Mrs. Rodriguez, who was wonderful with Emma, but whose salary consumed most of my paycheck. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me that I was working full-time to pay someone else to raise my daughter. But I was drowning. My days blurred together in an endless cycle of diapers, deadlines, grocery shopping, and sleepless nights. The newspaper job, which had once felt like a stepping stone, became a necessity I couldn't afford to lose. Our comfortable life required both incomes, despite David's growing success. He'd spend weekends golfing with clients while I caught up on laundry and errands. When I asked for help with the children, he'd remind me that his weekend networking was crucial for our financial security. Jake's arrival 2 years later only intensified the pressure. Emma was still a toddler, requiring constant attention, and now there was a newborn who seemed to cry for hours every night. David's business had expanded again, this time into international markets, which meant even more travel and longer absences. I began to feel like I was losing my mind. Sleep deprivation made everything feel surreal and overwhelming. I would find myself crying in the grocery store parking lot or staring blankly at my computer screen at work, unable to focus on even simple tasks. When I tried to explain my struggles to David, he would remind me that other women managed career and family successfully. "Look at Jennifer Morrison," he would say, referring to the wife of one of his business associates. "She's a partner at her law firm and has 3 kids. She never complains about being tired or overwhelmed. Maybe you need to be more organized or efficient with your time." The comparison to Jennifer Morrison stung particularly because I knew it was unfair. Jennifer had a live-in nanny, a housekeeper, and a husband who worked normal business hours and was home most evenings and weekends. But David seemed genuinely unable to see the difference in our circumstances, or perhaps he simply chose not to see it. The years passed in this strange contradiction of outward success and inner emptiness. David's consulting firm grew into a small empire. We moved to a larger house in a better neighborhood. Emma and Jake thrived in good schools. From the outside, we looked like the perfect American family. But inside, I felt myself disappearing piece by piece. The new house was David's dream come true, a sprawling colonial in the most prestigious neighborhood in our city. It had 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, a gourmet kitchen, and a 3-car garage. The mortgage payments were staggering, but David insisted we could afford it with his growing income and my steady salary. What he didn't account for was how the house would become another full-time job for me. The previous owners had maintained extensive gardens that required constant care. The hardwood floors needed weekly polishing. The large rooms meant more furniture to buy, more space to clean, more maintenance to coordinate. I found myself spending every free moment maintaining our beautiful home while David traveled for business or entertained clients. He would invite important contacts for dinner without consulting me, leaving me to scramble to prepare elaborate meals while managing 2 young children. When I suggested we hire a housekeeper, David balked at the expense. "The house is an investment," he explained, "but paying someone else to clean it is just throwing money away. Besides, you're home more than I am. It makes sense for you to handle the domestic responsibilities." I stopped mentioning my writing entirely. The notebook where I used to jot down story ideas gathered dust in a forgotten drawer. When Emma asked me what I wanted to be when I grew up, I stared at her, realizing I couldn't remember anymore. I had become David's wife, Emma and Jake's mother, but somewhere along the way, I had stopped being Sarah. Margaret retired when Emma was 6, and her replacement, Tom Bradley, had a very different vision for the newspaper. He eliminated most of the feature writing positions and restructured the administrative staff to focus solely on efficiency and cost-cutting. My job became even more mechanical, involving data entry and filing with no creative components whatsoever. I considered looking for other positions, but David discouraged any job changes. "Why rock the boat?" he would ask. "You have job security, good benefits, and a predictable schedule. Do you really want to start over somewhere new and risk losing all of that?" The practical arguments always won. We had 2 children, a large mortgage, and a lifestyle that required both of our incomes. Making any significant change felt impossible when the status quo, however unsatisfying, was stable and familiar. The emotional distance between David and me grew wider with each passing year. Our conversations revolved around schedules, finances, and the children's activities. When I tried to share my feelings of loneliness or my growing sense that life was passing me by, David would become defensive. "I work hard to provide for this family," he'd say. "I don't understand why you're not happy. Look at everything we have." David's definition of having everything was purely material. The beautiful house, the luxury cars, the private schools for the children, the annual vacations to expensive resorts. He genuinely couldn't understand why these achievements didn't fulfill me the way they fulfilled him. When I tried to explain my need for creative expression or meaningful work, he would listen with the polite attention he might give to a child's imaginary friend. "You used to be more practical," he would say. "You understood that security and stability matter more than personal fulfillment. That's what attracted me to you in the first place. You weren't one of those women who needed constant validation or dramatic career changes to feel good about themselves. But having everything and feeling fulfilled are not the same thing." I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, present but not really there. I went through the motions of living while feeling increasingly disconnected from any sense of purpose or passion. The woman who once stayed up until dawn writing poetry had been replaced by someone who fell asleep watching television, too exhausted to dream. David's success continued to accelerate throughout this period. His firm landed several major international contracts, and he was featured in business magazines as one of the city's most promising young entrepreneurs. He joined the country club, was invited to speak at industry conferences, and began mentoring other aspiring business owners. I attended these events as his supportive wife, smiling and making appropriate conversation while feeling increasingly like an actress playing a role I no longer understood. The other wives seemed so accomplished and confident, discussing their own careers and achievements while I struggled to find anything interesting to say about my administrative job or my role as a homemaker. One particularly painful evening at a Chamber of Commerce dinner, I found myself seated next to Dr. Amanda Pierce, a renowned pediatric surgeon who also had 2 young children. She spoke passionately about her research, her surgical innovations, and her efforts to mentor young women in medicine. When she asked about my work, I felt my face burn with embarrassment. "I work at the newspaper," I said quietly. "Administrative support." "Oh, how interesting." Amanda replied with genuine enthusiasm. "Are you involved in any of the editorial decisions?" I've always been fascinated by how news organizations decide which stories to prioritize. I had to explain that my role was purely clerical, that I had no involvement in the journalistic aspects of the paper. Amanda's expression shifted from interest to polite confusion, and I could see her struggling to find follow-up questions that wouldn't highlight how boring my professional life had become. When I turned 40, the milestone hit me like a physical blow. Half my life was over, and what did I have to show for it besides a marriage that felt more like a business partnership and children who were growing up fast enough that they'd soon need me less? I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. Where had Sarah gone? The birthday celebration David planned was typically elaborate and thoughtful in all the wrong ways. He invited 50 people to an expensive restaurant and gave a speech about what a wonderful wife and mother I was, how grateful he was for my sacrifices and dedication to our family. Everyone applauded, and I smiled and thanked him, but inside I felt like screaming. Later that night, after all the guests had gone home and the children were asleep, I sat in our master bathroom staring at myself in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was well-dressed, well-maintained, and completely hollow. I had achieved everything society told me I should want, but I felt emptier than I had ever felt in my life. That's when I found the business card for Dr. Elena Martinez, a therapist who specialized in women's issues and life transitions. Amanda Pierce had slipped it to me during the birthday party, perhaps sensing something in my demeanor that I thought I was hiding. I started therapy that year, telling David it was to help me manage the stress of balancing work and family. Dr. Martinez became the first person in years who asked me what I wanted, not what everyone else needed from me. In those weekly sessions, I began to excavate the buried dreams and desires I'd spent so long ignoring. It was painful work, confronting how completely I'd abandoned myself in service of everyone else's happiness. The therapy sessions became the only hour of my week that belonged entirely to me. Dr. Martinez's office was a sanctuary where I could speak honestly about my feelings without worrying about how they would affect David's mood or the children's stability. For the first time in years, someone was interested in my inner life, my hopes, my fears, my authentic thoughts and feelings. "When did you stop writing?" Dr. Martinez asked during one of our early sessions. I had to think about it. The transition had been so gradual that I couldn't pinpoint an exact moment. "I guess it just became impractical," I said. "Between work and the children and maintaining the house, there wasn't time for hobbies." "Writing wasn't a hobby for you," Dr. Martinez observed gently. "You described it as your passion, your dream career. When did pursuing your dreams become a luxury you couldn't afford?" The question haunted me for weeks. I began to recognize how I had internalized David's priorities as my own, how I had learned to see my desires as selfish and impractical. The woman who had once believed she could write meaningful stories had somehow convinced herself that wanting more than domestic contentment was ungrateful and unrealistic. Dr. Martinez helped me see the patterns I'd been blind to for so long. How David's support always came with conditions that kept me dependent. how his success was built partly on my willingness to handle everything else so he could focus entirely on his career, how my financial contributions had been essential to our comfortable lifestyle, but somehow I'd been convinced I was the fortunate one to have him as a provider. "You've spent 15 years making David's dreams possible," she said. "What would happen if you spent some time making your own dreams possible?" The question terrified me because I wasn't sure I remembered what my dreams were anymore. The young woman who had wanted to write novels felt like a stranger from another lifetime. But slowly, hesitantly, I began to reconnect with that part of myself. The children were teenagers now, increasingly independent and involved in their own lives. Emma was 16, passionate about environmental science and planning for college. Jake was 14, absorbed in basketball and video games. They still needed me, but not in the all-consuming way they had when they were small. For the first time in years, I had mental space to think about what I wanted for the remaining half of my life. Emma's growing independence particularly struck me. At 16, she was already more confident and self-assured than I had been at 30. She spoke passionately about climate change, participated in environmental activism, and planned to study environmental engineering in college. Watching her pursue her interests with such determination made me realize how completely I had abandoned my own passions. "Mom," she said one evening as we cleaned up after dinner, "do you ever regret not being a writer?" Her question caught me off guard. I hadn't realized she even knew about my old writing ambitions. "Where did that come from?" "I found some of your old stories in the basement," she admitted. "They were really good. Like, really, really good. I couldn't believe you wrote them. Why did you stop?" I struggled to find an answer that wouldn't make David look bad or make her worry about our family's stability. "Life got complicated," I said finally. "Sometimes you have to make choices about what's most important." Emma considered this with the seriousness she brought to everything. "But couldn't you start again now? Jake and I don't need as much attention anymore. And there are lots of writers who don't start until they're older, right?" Her innocent question opened a door I had thought was permanently closed. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe the woman who had dreamed of writing novels wasn't dead, just dormant. I started writing again in secret, staying up after everyone went to bed to work on a novel I'd been carrying in my heart for years. The words came slowly at first, rusty from disuse, but they came. I felt more alive during those midnight writing sessions than I had in years. When David asked why I was staying up so late, I told him I was having trouble sleeping. It wasn't entirely a lie. The story I was writing felt deeply personal, almost autobiographical. It was about a woman who had lost herself in the roles others expected her to play, who had to rediscover her identity and find the courage to claim her own life. Writing it felt like excavating pieces of my buried self, painful but necessary work that left me emotionally drained but spiritually renewed. David noticed changes in my mood and energy level, but he attributed them to the therapy rather than the writing. He was supportive of the counseling sessions, mainly because they seemed to make me more content with our life rather than less. He had no idea that Dr. Martinez was encouraging me to question the foundations of our relationship and consider what changes might be necessary for my personal growth. The novel grew over months of stolen time. I wrote during lunch breaks at work, hiding the notebook in my desk drawer. I wrote in the car while waiting for the children's activities to end. I wrote in the bathroom, the only place in the house where I could be alone for more than 5 minutes without someone needing something from me. As the story developed, I began to see my own life with new clarity. The protagonist's journey towards self-discovery paralleled my own awakening to the ways I had diminished myself over the years. Writing her story helped me understand my story, and the more I understood, the less willing I became to accept the status quo. But change felt terrifying when the current situation, however unsatisfying, was stable and familiar. David and I had built a life together, even if it no longer fit me. The children needed stability. Our finances were intertwined in complex ways. Starting over at 40 felt both liberating and impossible. I researched freelance writing opportunities, looked into writing workshops, and started imagining what my life might look like if I had the courage to change it. The possibilities were exciting but overwhelming. Could I really risk everything we had built for something as uncertain as a writing career? Dr. Martinez helped me work through these fears and contradictions. She pointed out that I was already risking something precious by staying in a situation that was slowly eroding my sense of self. "What's the cost of not pursuing your dreams?" she asked. What happens to you if you continue on this path for another 20 years? The question forced me to confront a future I had been trying not to imagine. 20 more years of watching David's life expand while mine contracted. 20 more years of defining myself entirely through my relationships to other people. 20 more years of wondering what might have been if I had found the courage to choose myself. Meanwhile, David's business continued to thrive. He had expanded into international consulting, helping American companies establish operations in emerging markets. The work required extensive travel, sometimes for weeks at a time, leaving me to manage the household and children largely alone. During one of his longer trips to Southeast Asia, I had a conversation with my neighbor, Patricia Williams, that shifted something fundamental in my perspective. Patricia was a successful real estate agent who had built her business while raising 3 children largely as a single mother after her husband's early death. "I see you struggling," she said gently as we watched our children play in her backyard. "You look exhausted all the time, and you seem so sad. Is everything okay with you and David?" I started to give my usual response about being fine, just tired, but something in Patricia's kind expression made me tell the truth. I found myself sharing my feelings of loneliness, my abandoned dreams, my growing sense that I was disappearing into the roles others needed me to play. Patricia listened without judgment, nodding with recognition. "I felt that way in my marriage too," she admitted. "Not because my husband was a bad man, but because I had made myself so small to accommodate his life that there wasn't room for mine anymore. When he died, I was devastated, but I was also forced to rediscover who I was outside of being his wife." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You don't have to wait for tragedy to give yourself permission to have a life. You can choose to reclaim yourself while you still have time to enjoy it." Her words stayed with me for days. The idea that I could choose to reclaim myself, that I didn't have to wait for external circumstances to change, was both empowering and terrifying. What would it look like to stop waiting for David's permission to pursue my dreams? What would happen if I simply started making choices based on what I wanted rather than what everyone else needed? The opportunity to test these questions came sooner than I expected. Margaret Chun, my former supervisor who had retired several years earlier, called with an unexpected offer. She had been hired as a freelance editor for a new literary magazine and was looking for contributing writers. "I've never forgotten your writing," she said. "You had such a distinctive voice, such insight into human nature. We're looking for personal essays, memoir pieces, fiction that explores women's experiences. The pay isn't much, but it's publication credit and a chance to get back into writing." I felt my heart racing as I listened to her describe the opportunity. This was exactly the kind of work I had dreamed of doing, the chance to write meaningful pieces that might connect with readers and help me build a portfolio. But then reality set in. The magazine wanted a quick turnaround, articles submitted within 2 weeks. I would need to write in the evenings and weekends, time that was already stretched thin with family and household responsibilities. And David was about to leave for another business trip, meaning I would be managing everything alone. I almost declined immediately, falling back into the pattern of putting everyone else's needs first. But something Margaret had said stuck with me. "You had such a distinctive voice." Past tense. Had. As if that voice no longer existed. As if I had already given up on the person I used to be. "I'll do it," I heard myself saying. "Send me the details." After hanging up, I sat in stunned silence. I had just committed to something entirely for myself, without consulting David or considering how it might disrupt our routine. The decision felt both reckless and absolutely necessary. I told David about the writing opportunity when he returned from his trip, framing it as a small freelance project that wouldn't interfere with my regular responsibilities. He listened with polite interest, but immediately began pointing out potential problems. "When will you have time to write?" he asked. "And what about Emma's college applications? She's going to need help with essays and campus visits this year. Plus, Jake has basketball season starting, which means driving him to practice and games every week." I explained that I would write in the evenings after everyone went to bed, that it was just one article and wouldn't take much time. David nodded, but looked skeptical. "Just make sure it doesn't become a distraction from your real priorities," he said. "The children need consistency, especially with Emma's senior year being so stressful." His response shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. I had expected him to be proud of me for getting back into writing, to celebrate this small step toward reclaiming my creative identity. Instead, He was already setting boundaries around my involvement, making sure it remained safely contained within the margins of our established life. But I was no longer the woman who automatically deferred to his judgment. Months of therapy and secret writing had awakened something in me that couldn't be put back to sleep. I was going to write this article, and I was going to do it well. The piece I submitted to Margaret was a personal essay about the challenge of maintaining individual identity within marriage and motherhood. I wrote about the gradual process of self-erasure that many women experience, the way we learn to see our own needs as selfish and our dreams as luxuries we can't afford. Writing it felt like performing surgery on my own life, examining patterns and choices with unflinching honesty. I wrote about the young woman who had dreamed of writing novels, about the compromises that had seemed reasonable at the time, about the slow recognition that I had given away pieces of myself until there was almost nothing left. When Margaret called to tell me they wanted to publish the essay, I cried with relief and terror. Relief because my words had mattered to someone, because my voice was still there after all these years of silence. Terror because publication would make my internal struggles visible to anyone who knew me, including David. The essay appeared in the magazine 3 months later, accompanied by a small bio that identified me as a writer living in our city. Several people from our social circle mentioned seeing it, most responding with surprised congratulations. They hadn't known I wrote, hadn't realized I had interests beyond supporting David's career and raising our children. David's reaction was more complicated. He read the essay twice, his expression growing more troubled with each reading. Finally, he set the magazine down and looked at me with something that might have been disappointment. "This is very personal," he said carefully. "I'm not sure how comfortable I am with you sharing our private life with strangers." I pointed out that I hadn't mentioned him by name or shared specific details about our marriage. The essay was about universal experiences that many women would recognize, not intimate secrets about our relationship. "But people will make assumptions," he continued. "They'll read this and think you're unhappy in our marriage, that I'm somehow failing as a husband. Is that really the image you want to project about our family?" His concern wasn't about my writing or my need for creative expression. It was about how my honesty might reflect on him, how my personal growth might threaten the carefully constructed image of our perfect life. I tried to explain that the essay wasn't an attack on our marriage, but an exploration of challenges that many couples face. I emphasized how important writing was to my sense of self, how much I needed this creative outlet after years of focusing entirely on everyone else's needs. But David remained uncomfortable with what he saw as unnecessary exposure of our private life. "Can't you write fiction instead?" he suggested. "Made-up stories that don't involve real people or situations. That way you can be creative without putting our personal business out there for everyone to analyze." His suggestion revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood my need to write. Fiction versus nonfiction wasn't the point. The point was having a voice, being seen as more than just someone's wife and mother, contributing something meaningful to conversations that mattered to me. The success of that first essay led to more opportunities. Margaret introduced me to other editors, and I began writing regularly for several publications. The work was part-time and the pay was modest, but it was mine. I was building something that belonged to me, independent of my roles in other people's lives. As my writing gained recognition, I noticed changes in how people responded to me at social gatherings. Instead of asking only about David's business or the children's activities, they wanted to discuss my articles, my perspectives on the topics I explored. I was being seen as a person with something valuable to contribute, not just as someone's supportive spouse. These changes were exhilarating, but also disruptive to the equilibrium David and I had maintained for so many years. He began making comments about how much time I spent writing, how distracted I seemed during family activities, how my new interests were affecting my availability for the social and domestic responsibilities he had come to expect. "You used to be more present," he said one evening after I had declined to attend a client dinner because I had a deadline. "Lately, it feels like your mind is always somewhere else." He wasn't wrong. My mind was often elsewhere, absorbed in the stories I was working on, the ideas I was exploring, the conversations with other writers that were opening new worlds to me. For the first time in years, I had intellectual stimulation that challenged me and made me grow. But David experienced my mental engagement with writing as a withdrawal from our family life. He couldn't understand that having a creative outlet made me more fulfilled and present, not less. To him, any energy I devoted to writing was energy stolen from my real responsibilities. The tension came to a head when I was offered the opportunity to attend a weekend writing retreat in the mountains. The retreat was led by a respected novelist and would involve intensive workshops on craft and technique. It was exactly the kind of professional development I needed to take my writing to the next level. When I told David about the retreat, his immediate response was frustration. "A whole weekend?" he asked. "What about Emma's college interviews? She has 3 scheduled for that month, and you promised to drive her to campus visits." I checked the calendar and confirmed that the retreat didn't conflict with any of Emma's appointments. David then raised concerns about the cost, the precedent it would set, the message it would send about my priorities. "This feels like it's becoming more than a hobby," he said. "How much time and money are you going to invest in something that may never pay off? We have real responsibilities and goals that need our attention." His use of the word hobby stung. After months of published articles and growing recognition, he still saw my writing as a frivolous pastime rather than meaningful work. The dismissal felt like a denial of everything I had accomplished and everything I hoped to achieve. I attended the retreat despite his objections, and it was transformative. Being surrounded by other serious writers, discussing craft and technique, sharing work and receiving thoughtful feedback reminded me of who I had always been underneath the roles I had learned to play. One of the other participants, a woman named Catherine who had published several novels while raising 4 children, became a crucial mentor. She shared her own story of reclaiming her creative identity after years of focusing entirely on family, and her success gave me hope that it might not be too late for me to build a writing career. "The hardest part isn't finding time to write," Catherine told me. "It's believing you deserve to take up space as an artist, that your voice matters enough to demand attention and resources. Family will always expand to consume whatever energy you're willing to give. You have to set boundaries and protect your creative work, or it will disappear." Her words crystallized something I had been struggling to articulate. I had been treating my writing as something I could pursue only when it didn't inconvenience anyone else, only when it fitted neatly into the margins of everyone else's needs. But art doesn't work that way. Creative work requires dedicated time, mental space, and the belief that what you're creating matters enough to prioritize it over other demands. When I returned from the retreat, I implemented some of Catherine's suggestions. I carved out specific hours for writing and protected them as fiercely as I would any other important appointment. I set up a small office in our basement, a space that was entirely mine where I could write without interruption. David noticed these changes and responded with increasing resistance. He began scheduling family activities during my designated writing times, claiming he had forgotten about my schedule. He made comments about the basement office being a waste of space that could be used for storage or a workshop for Jake. "You're becoming obsessed with this writing thing," he said after I declined to host his business partner's birthday party because it conflicted with a major deadline. "It's affecting your judgment and your priorities. Family should come first, always." But I was beginning to question whose definition of family first we were using. When David traveled for business, family somehow managed to function without him. When he worked late or attended client events, we adapted our schedule around his professional needs. But when I needed time for my work, it was framed as selfish neglect of family responsibilities. The double standard became increasingly difficult to ignore. David's career had always been treated as a family priority, something we all needed to support and accommodate. But my creative work was treated as a personal indulgence that should only be pursued when it didn't inconvenience anyone else. Meanwhile, my writing was gaining momentum in ways I had never imagined possible. An agent in New York had read several of my published essays and reached out to discuss representing me for a book project. Rachel Weinstein explained that there was growing interest in memoirs by women who had rediscovered their identities later in life. "Your voice is authentic and relatable," Rachel told me during our first phone conversation. "You're writing about experiences that millions of women share, but rarely see reflected in literature. There's definitely a market for a full-length memoir exploring these themes." The possibility of writing a book felt both thrilling and terrifying. It would require months of intensive work, far more time and commitment than my article writing had demanded. It would also mean exposing even more of my personal journey, diving deeper into the painful process of recognizing how I had lost myself and the difficult work of finding my way back. When I told David about Rachel's interest, his reaction was immediate and negative. "A book?" he said, his voice rising with disbelief. "Sarah, that's completely unrealistic. When would you have time to write a whole book? And what would it be about, exactly?" I explained Rachel's vision for a memoir about women reclaiming their identities, about the challenges of maintaining individuality within marriage and motherhood. David's expression grew more troubled as I spoke. "You want to write a book about our marriage?" he asked. "About how unhappy you've been? That's incredibly unfair, Sarah. You're talking about exposing our private life, our struggles, our personal business to complete strangers." I tried to explain that the book wouldn't be an attack on him or our relationship, that it would focus on universal experiences rather than specific details about our marriage. But David couldn't see past his fear of how he might be portrayed. "What will people think?" he continued. "Our friends, our business associates, Emma and Jake's classmates? They'll read this book and assume I'm some kind of terrible husband who's been oppressing you for 20 years. His concern was entirely about external perception, about how my honesty might damage his reputation. There was no curiosity about why I needed to tell this story, no interest in understanding what the writing meant to me, no consideration of how important this opportunity was for my professional development. That night, I lay awake thinking about Catherine's words at the retreat. "Family will always expand to consume whatever energy you're willing to give. You have to set boundaries and protect your creative work, or it will disappear." I realized I had reached a crossroads. I could abandon the book project to preserve peace in my marriage, returning to the safe margins where my creative work didn't threaten anyone's comfort. Or I could claim this opportunity and risk whatever consequences came with choosing myself. The decision felt enormous because I understood it wasn't really about one book. It was about what kind of life I was going to live for the next 20 years, what kind of example I was going to set for my children, what kind of woman I was going to become. I called Rachel the next morning and told her I wanted to move forward with the book proposal. The commitment felt both terrifying and exhilarating, like jumping off a cliff and growing wings on the way down. The months that followed were intense and transformative. I wrote every morning before work, every evening after dinner, every weekend hour I could steal. The book poured out of me like water breaking through a dam, 20 years of suppressed thoughts and feelings finally finding expression. David watched this process with growing alarm and resentment. He complained that I was neglecting household responsibilities, that Emma and Jake were getting less attention, that I seemed distracted and unavailable for family activities. "You're changing," he said one evening after I had declined to watch a movie with the family because I was in the middle of a difficult chapter. "You're becoming someone I don't recognize. Someone selfish and obsessed with your own needs." The accusation of selfishness stung because I had been conditioned to fear it for so long. But months of therapy and writing had given me new perspective on what selfishness actually meant. Was it selfish to pursue meaningful work that fulfilled me intellectually and creatively? Was it selfish to model for my children that women could have ambitions beyond serving their families? Or was it actually selfish to expect one person to abandon their dreams entirely so that everyone else's comfort could remain undisturbed? The book proposal process took longer than I had anticipated. Rachel submitted the manuscript to multiple publishers, and the waiting was excruciating. Weeks passed with no response, then months. I began to wonder if David had been right, if I was deluding myself about the value of my work and the possibility of success. Then, on a Tuesday morning in March, Rachel called with news that changed everything. A major publishing house wanted to buy my book. The advance was more than I made in a year at the newspaper, and they were interested in discussing a 2-book deal. I sat in my car in the newspaper parking lot, shaking as Rachel explained the terms of the offer. This wasn't just validation of my writing. It was financial independence, the possibility of supporting myself through creative work, the chance to build a career entirely on my own terms. When I told David that evening, his response was unlike anything I had expected. Instead of congratulating me or celebrating this achievement, he became angry in a way I had rarely seen. "This is ridiculous," he said, pacing around our kitchen. "One book deal, and you think you're going to become some famous writer? Publishing is incredibly unpredictable, Sarah. What happens when this book doesn't sell? What happens when no one wants a second book? I pointed out that the advance alone would cover my living expenses for more than a year, giving me time to write the second book and build a sustainable career. But David wasn't interested in practical discussions about the opportunity. "This is going to destroy our family," he continued. "You're going to quit your steady job for some fantasy about being an author. What about health insurance? What about retirement savings? What about providing stability for Emma and Jake?" His concerns were the same ones he had raised about every opportunity one had considered over the years. But this time I heard them differently. These weren't practical worries about our family's well-being. They were attempts to keep me dependent, to ensure that I never became financially independent enough to make choices he couldn't control. The realization was devastating and liberating at the same time. For 20 years, I had believed David's concerns were protective, that his caution was motivated by love and wisdom. But now I could see how his protection had systematically limited my opportunities and kept me trapped in roles that served his needs more than mine. That night, we had the biggest fight of our marriage. David accused me of being selfish, unrealistic, and ungrateful for everything we had built together. I accused him of being threatened by my success and unwilling to support my dreams unless they remained safely subordinate to his own. "You used to be supportive," David said at one point. "You used to understand that family comes first, that stability matters more than personal fulfillment. Now you're willing to risk everything we've worked for just to see your name on a book cover." "I used to be invisible," I replied. "And you liked it that way because it meant you never had to consider anyone's needs but your own." "But I'm not invisible anymore, David. I'm not content with a simple life. And if you can't celebrate my dreams instead of trying to manage them, then maybe we don't want the same kind of marriage anymore." The words hung in the air between us like a bridge burning. We both knew that something fundamental had changed, that we couldn't go back to the way things were before. I moved into the guest room that night and began making plans I had never thought I would need to make. I researched apartments, calculated how much I could afford on my own, and had difficult conversations with Emma and Jake about what might happen next. Emma, now 17 and sharp as a knife, took the news with remarkable maturity. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" she asked directly. I told her honestly that we were working through some serious problems, that I couldn't predict what would happen, but that both of us would always be there for her and Jake regardless of what happened to our marriage. "Good," she said with teenage bluntness. "You've seemed sad for a really long time, Mom. I'm glad you're finally doing something about it. And I think it's amazing that you wrote a book. I can't wait to read it." Jake's reaction was more complicated. At 15, he was old enough to understand that our marriage was in trouble, but young enough to hope it could be fixed. He worried about dividing time between two houses, about how our separation would affect his basketball season and his social life. "I just want you both to be happy," he said finally. "But I wish you could be happy together." His words broke my heart because I wished the same thing. Despite everything, I still loved David. We had built a life together, raised two remarkable children, shared 20 years of history and memory. The end of our marriage wasn't about hatred or betrayal. It was about fundamental incompatibility that had become impossible to ignore. David tried to convince me to reconsider the book deal, to return to our previous life, and forget about writing professionally. He suggested couples therapy, promised to be more supportive of my creative interests, offered compromises that would allow me to write as long as it remained secondary to my family responsibilities. But I had finally learned the difference between compromise and capitulation. Real compromise would involve both of us making significant changes to create space for both of our dreams. What David was offering was minor adjustments that would allow him to feel generous while ensuring that nothing fundamental changed about our dynamic. I had spent 20 years making myself smaller so that our marriage would work. I couldn't do it anymore, not even to save the life we had built together. The book process moved quickly once I accepted the offer. I quit my job at the newspaper, using the advance to support myself while I completed revisions and worked on the second book. The freedom to focus entirely on writing was intoxicating after years of stealing moments between other obligations. David and I continued living in the same house, but leading increasingly separate lives. We attended Emma's graduation together, maintained polite conversation at family dinners, and tried to present a united front for the children. But the emotional distance between us grew wider each day. I found a small apartment across town, a space that would be entirely mine once the separation became official. It had large windows, hardwood floors, and a second bedroom I could use as an office. Standing in the empty rooms, I felt both terrified and exhilarated by the prospect of starting over at 45. Then came the Christmas party at David's office. It was December 2010, and David's firm was celebrating their most successful year yet. I wore the black dress David had chosen for me, smiled, and made small talk with his colleagues and their wives. I'd attended dozens of these events over the years, playing the role of the supportive spouse while David networked and celebrated his achievements. But this night was different. During the dinner portion of the evening, David stood to give a speech thanking everyone who had contributed to the company's success. He thanked his employees, his mentors, his key clients. He talked about the sacrifices and hard work that had built the business. And then he said something that would change everything. Most importantly, David said, raising his wine glass, I want to thank my wife Sarah for being content with a simple life and never demanding more than I could give. Some wives want careers and recognition, but Sarah has always been satisfied with supporting our family behind the scenes. Her contentment with the traditional role has allowed me to focus completely on building something meaningful. The room erupted in applause while I sat frozen in my chair. Content with a simple life. Satisfied with the traditional role. The words echoed in my head as people smiled and nodded approvingly at me. In that moment, I saw myself through David's eyes, and it was devastating. He genuinely believed I had chosen this life, that I was naturally suited for it, that my lack of ambition was a virtue that had enabled his success. But what broke my heart most was the realization that he was describing a version of me that no longer existed, if it ever had. The woman sitting at that table had a book coming out in 6 months, had an agent advocating for her work, had discovered she was capable of supporting herself through creative labor. Yet her husband was still introducing her to the world as someone who had never wanted anything more than the opportunity to fade into the background of his achievements. I smiled and accepted the congratulations of his colleagues for being such a wonderful, supportive wife. I played the part perfectly, as I had for so many years. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. The woman who had been content to disappear was fully awake now, and she was done pretending to be someone she wasn't. The drive home was silent. David was glowing with the success of the evening, occasionally commenting on various conversations he'd had or connections he'd made. I stared out the window at the familiar neighborhoods we passed, seeing them as if for the first time. When we arrived home, David went to his office to check emails while I sat in my car in the driveway, still processing what had happened. His words replayed in my mind. Content with a simple life. Never demanding more than I could give. The description felt like an obituary for someone I had never been. I realized that David's speech wasn't really about me at all. It was about the wife he needed me to be for his story to make sense, the supporting character who made his success possible by asking for nothing in return. The real Sarah, the woman who wrote books and had ambitions and needed more than a supporting role, was invisible to him even when she was sitting right in front of him. 3 days later, I told David I was moving out. The conversation was heartbreaking and necessary, filled with tears and recriminations and the painful acknowledgement that we had grown into incompatible people. I don't understand, he said. I thought we were working things out. I thought the writing was helping you feel more fulfilled. I tried to explain that the problem wasn't whether I felt fulfilled. It was whether he could see me as a complete person with needs and dreams that deserved equal consideration to his own. The Christmas party speech had revealed that even after months of my growing success as a writer, he still fundamentally saw me as someone whose highest aspiration was supporting his achievements. That's not what I meant, he protested. I was just thanking you for all the sacrifices you've made for our family. I was trying to honor everything you've given up for us. But that was exactly the problem. He was honoring my sacrifices instead of celebrating my achievements. He was grateful for what I had given up rather than excited about what I was building. After 20 years of marriage, he still couldn't imagine me as anything other than someone whose job was to make his life possible. The separation was difficult for everyone, but it was also liberating in ways I hadn't anticipated. In my small apartment, surrounded by my books and my writing, I began to remember who I was when I wasn't constantly adapting myself to someone else's needs and expectations. My book was published 6 months later to positive reviews and modest sales. More importantly, it found its audience, connecting with women who recognized their own struggles in my story. The letters from readers were overwhelming, filled with gratitude for articulating experiences they had thought were unique to them. Emma and Jake adjusted to splitting time between their father's house and my apartment with typical teenage resilience. They seemed to understand, even if they couldn't fully articulate it, that I was happier and more present as a single mother than I had been as an unhappy wife. "You're different now," Emma told me one evening as we cooked dinner together in my small kitchen. "You seem more like yourself, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For the first time in decades, I was living as myself rather than performing a role someone else had written for me. The second book sold based on a proposal and the success of the first. I began speaking at conferences and workshops, connecting with other writers, and building a career I had never imagined possible. The financial independence was crucial, but the psychological freedom was even more valuable. I also began dating, cautiously and selectively. After 20 years with David, I had forgotten what it felt like to be seen and appreciated for who I was rather than what I could provide. The first man I went out with listened to me talk about my writing for an entire dinner without once suggesting it wasn't practical. The simple act of having my passion taken seriously by someone else was deeply moving. Not all the relationships led anywhere serious, but each one reminded me that there were people in the world who could appreciate the woman I was becoming. I wasn't in a hurry to remarry, but I was open to the possibility that love could look different from what I had known before. David and I finalized our divorce after 2 years of separation. The process was painful but ultimately amicable, focused on ensuring that Emma and Jake felt supported and loved by both parents. We would never be friends, but we had found a way to co-parent effectively without causing our children additional pain. 5 years after that Christmas party speech, I had published 4 books and established myself as a respected voice in conversations about women's identity and empowerment. I owned a small house with a garden where I grew vegetables and flowers. Emma was thriving in college, studying environmental engineering with the confidence of someone who had always been encouraged to pursue her dreams. Jake was excelling in high school, planning to study creative writing himself. David had remarried, choosing a woman who seemed genuinely content with the traditional role I had never been able to fully embrace. I felt no resentment toward either of them. They had found what made them happy, just as I had found what made me happy. Most importantly, I had learned to recognize my own voice again. I woke up each morning excited about the work I got to do, the stories I got to tell, the life I got to live. I was no longer content with a simple life because I had learned that my life didn't have to be simple to be meaningful. Looking back, I think about the woman I was at that Christmas party sometimes, sitting silently while her husband described her as someone without ambition or dreams. I feel compassion for her now, understanding how she arrived at that point through 1,000 small compromises and quiet surrenders. But I also feel proud of her for refusing to stay there, for choosing the difficult path of growth over the easy path of resignation. To anyone reading this who sees themselves in my story, who feels invisible in their own life, who has been told their dreams aren't practical or important, I want you to know this. You are not too old, it is not too late, and your dreams are not too small or too large to matter. The world needs what you have to offer, but first, you have to believe that you have something to offer. The breaking point doesn't have to break you. Sometimes it's the moment when you finally break free.